once in a while, we're going to take a detour out of the book of Romans to talk about a topic that the book of Romans is speaking about. And as you know, in Romans chapter 1, one of the issues that is spoken of is this issue of homosexuality. Paul calls it indecent acts, that men gave up the natural function to sleep with other men and women did the same. And he says that this is one stage of depravity that ultimately leads into insanity. So we're going to talk about, as we talked about last time, the fact that same-sex marriage is how this issue is manifested in our culture today, and we're going to talk about how there's nothing gay about same-sex marriage, and how same-sex marriage will hurt everyone, and I'll explain what that means here in just a minute. And we're not really going to use the Bible to make our case here, because when you go in the public square, you have to use good reason, and you run into a lot of trouble when you just try and quote Bible verses to people. They're going to give you a number of objections, including the separation of church and state and many other ones. We'll deal with those here tonight, because as you know, last time we talked about this issue, we covered why same-sex marriage should not be endorsed publicly. But let's review very briefly where we were last time. We talked about the question, why should Christians care about this issue? And last time we mentioned that this issue is a very important issue to the moral health of our nation. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. I also want to point out that we will be correct, not politically correct. This will not be an issue, or this will not be a segment where we're going to be talking about gay bashing or any of that. We're just going to try and give good reasons why we think, or why I think anyway, that same-sex marriage ought not be endorsed by the federal or state government. And you'll see why that's the case in just a minute. In fact, last time we were here, we covered these three areas. Actually, we just started with point 1 when we covered why should same-sex marriage, or why should the state endorse traditional marriage, I should say. Why should the state endorse traditional marriage? Some say, the state ought to stay out of marriage at all. It ought to just be in churches or synagogues or whatever that church has done. It ought to just be a religious right, but the government ought not be involved in it. Then secondly, we talked about why should the state not endorse same-sex marriage, and then we briefly talked about the objections. Tonight we're going to spend most of our time in the objections, because we covered points 1 and 2 last time. Let's just review what we did last time. Why should the state endorse traditional marriage? And we pointed out that traditional marriage is our national immune system. When our marriages are strong, our country is strong. When our marriages are weak, our country is weak. And you can look at the weakening of our nation when we basically got rid of traditional marriage and made it much easier for divorce to occur. We've seen a number of social problems that have resulted pretty much as a direct result of liberalizing marriage laws, or making divorce easier to come by. And we pointed out that traditional marriage is really the foundation of a civilized society. The best form of government is a two-parent, mom-dad family. We pointed this out last time. When you have strong families, you have lower social costs and lower welfare. You have domesticated men. Remember how we talked about how men are predators? Single men are predators. We talked about this last time. So single women, don't trust single men. Because one of the beneficial aspects of traditional marriage is it domesticates men. It also protects women from uncommitted men, because women give up a lot more in a marriage than do men. They're the ones that can bear children. We also talked about how the fact that abortion, child abuse, a number of other issues go away when people live faithfully in traditional marriage. It's the best place to raise children. We talked about how children do better in a two-parent mother-father home, much better than those who are outside of a two-parent home. So it's our national immune system. And then we talked about why should the state not endorse same-sex marriage, and we pointed out this quote from a man who calls himself a liberal Democrat. His name is David Blankenhorn. In 2007, he wrote a book called The Future of Marriage. He says, I'm pro-gay. I think the Bible's wrong about homosexuality, but he says, I cannot be for same-sex marriage. Why? Here's a quote from David Blankenhorn. He says, across history and cultures, marriage's single most fundamental idea is that every child needs a mother and a father. Changing marriage to accommodate same-sex couples would nullify this principle in culture and in law. He's absolutely right. Why? We talked about it last time. There's only 3 things the government can do on any issue. The first thing it can do is prohibit it. It could prohibit the activity. It could permit the activity, or it could go further and promote the activity. We used the example last time of alcohol. For a while we prohibited alcohol. Now we permit it, alcohol use, but we still have restrictions on it, and we don't allow anybody at any time for any reason under any circumstances to use it, because we know it is very lethal. What we don't do as a government is we don't promote it. We don't want people drinking. It causes too much trouble, but we allow it to happen. Now, when it comes to marriage, traditional marriage, we not only permit it, we promote it, because the government wins, and everybody wins when people stay together in traditional two-marriage or traditional two-parent families. What we can't do is promote same-sex marriage. Why not? Because by legalizing same-sex marriage or civil unions, because that's also a promotion of the behavior, we will be promoting behavior that will hurt traditional marriage and children, that it will also hurt you as an individual citizen, and ironically it would hurt homosexuals themselves. Why is it going to hurt traditional marriage and children? Because it will break the link between childbearing and marriage. Because if marriage is just about coupling, if same-sex couples can get married and it's just the same relationship legally and culturally as traditional marriage, then no longer is marriage about children. Marriage is just about coupling, and when marriage is just about coupling, then people no longer get married to have children. But you notice they have children anyway. They have children out of wedlock. There are no illegitimate children, there are only illegitimate parents. And when people have children out of wedlock, they not only break up at higher rates than people who are in marriage, but they create society a whole number of other problems, because now these children are out there and society winds up picking up the tab. Not only in terms of all the social costs and welfare, but also in the costs of crime. And I don't have time to go into the next 2 about you being hurt and homosexuals. It's on the DVD from last time, so get that. But let's now move on to a couple of quotes we used last time, because I think it sets the tone for what we're trying to do. This is what David Kupelian says about love. He says, "We've forgotten in society what love is, because supporting and justifying homosexuality is not real love any more than glorifying drinking helps the alcoholic, or celebrating smoking helps wipe out lung cancer." He says, "The most loving stance for others to take, for us and others to take, is not to serve as enablers of self-destructive immoral compulsions, but to stand in patient and firm opposition." We have to stand in patient and firm opposition, just like we do when our children do things that we know are going to hurt them. And then we talked about Jay Budziszewski's quote about false compassion. He says, "Real compassion ought to make us visit the prisoner, dry out the alcoholic, help the pregnant girl prepare for the baby, and encourage the young homosexual to live chastely. But how much easier it is to forget the prisoner, give the drunk a drink, send the girl to the abortionist, and tell the kid to just give in." False compassion is a great deal less work than true. And it is. And Christians have been cowards on this issue. We've been hiding under the table while homosexual activists take over and change the culture. And we're just hiding under the table saying, well, it's much more compassionate just to say, this is all about love, go ahead. Well, it's not all about love, and we'll explain that a little bit later. All right? Now, let's answer all the objections if we can, and here are some of the objections. We want equal rights. Don't put discrimination in the Constitution, because there's a constitutional amendment that's out there to try and ban same-sex marriage. Homosexuality is like race. Homosexuals were born that way. Homosexuals can't change. Some animals engage in the behavior. Opposing same-sex marriage is like opposing interracial marriage. Opposing same-sex marriage is bigotry. You've heard these. Same-sex marriage is about love. Homosexual couples have been together for years, so that proves that we ought to make it universal. Same-sex or some marriages do not produce children. You've already ruined marriage through divorce. And why are you singling out homosexuality? Why don't you talk about divorce and adultery and all those other things you Christians do? You know, you ought not judge anyway. And by the way, you're just a homophobe. You'll get that, right? And then the big one that's thrown out a lot is this is a separation of church and state issue, and you Christians are trying to impose your religion on us, and you know that that can't be done according to the First Amendment. Right?